Look, the truth of proportional representation for me is along the same lines as what I would say with independence. Again, it's informed by my direct experience of the Irish system, where we've had PRSTV, which is of course a PR system, but a mixed PR system, for decades, and it's produced endless right-wing governments. So there's no panacea to proportional representation. It doesn't automatically give you more progressive outcomes. What it does do is incentivize the fragmentation of a political system. And when you've got two cartel parties, like for such a long time Britain did with the Labour Party and with the Tories, a Labour Party which, while it had union and Labour roots, was very much overtaken by right-wing and pro-imperial and so on interests at the upper echelons, and a Tory party that was built to serve the interests of the concentrated powers of wealth. I can see the incentive for it. All that being said, the fragmentation of politics is not necessarily the best solution if you are, as I am, a socialist, because what you end up with is a range of parties reflecting all kinds of different identities and interests that people have, and you end up with the same process of negotiation around coalition at the end of a PR system as you have internally in parties, effectively in first past the post systems. And if you believe, as I do, that there's a fundamental fault line in politics, the fundamental fault line is the fault line of class. It's the fault line of the masses of ordinary people who have to work for a living against the minority of people who live on the basis of their wealth. And it's the concentrated power of that wealth that structures all of our politics, including, by the way, creating the climate crisis by a system that is entirely based upon the valorization of capital, that it's entirely based upon wealth expanding wealth, and any social function that it produces under capitalism is simply a byproduct of somebody having made a profit somewhere else. And if you believe that that's the fundamental fault line of politics, well, then you've got a great inclination to line us all up in two great teams of working people against capital, and to try to find ways of doing that. That is not what tends to happen in first past the post systems, of course, because overall the political system itself is controlled by those same interests. And so you end up with two parties representing capital to varying degrees, rather than one representing capital and one representing labor. But if you do have the fragmentation, you have to open yourself up to the realities. And those realities include things like major presence of far-right figures in your parliament. Scotland right now doesn't have a very advanced and developed far-right. I could have said the same about Ireland a few years ago. We increasingly now do have one in the Republic of Ireland. And I think within 10 years, whether it be Aintu or other forces, will end up being significant players in the Dáil. You have, obviously, if you'd had a proportional representation system in England, you would have had a very large BNP contingent, a very large UKIP contingent, a very large Brexit Party contingent, and you would have to deal with the realities of those. And again, in a country like the United States, which has a completely ludicrous anti-democratic political system, but if you believe that the path to democracy would simply be to create right now a Trumpist Republican Party organized around the politics of the kind of people who stormed the Capitol, well then, you're opening up for yourselves very serious difficulties down the road, because if you allow the far right into that degree of normalization, you better have a bloody good social program and a bloody good left-wing government to drain the swamp that creates those kind of fascist movements. And as we stand right now, we don't have that. I don't foresee that there's a kind of a new socialist breakthrough coming on the horizon, and we might end up with a proportional representation system pretty easily, I would suspect, with a very strong presence of the far right, breakaway forces on the left from the Labour Party perhaps, but not even being particularly strong. And then we would be looking at a parliament that doesn't look radically different than the one you have right now. Yes, the Tories would be weakened, but there's plenty of proportional representation systems across Europe which have delivered decades upon decades of conservative rule. The one right next door to you being a good example.